They carried him into the forest at midnight, tied like an animal. Not a stranger, not a criminal. His own son. The boy was only 8 years old. His crime? Being born to a mother who died too soon. His punishment? A stepmother's jealousy and a father too weak to say no. They left him bound to an ancient tree deep in the forbidden forest. A place where even grown men fear to tread. Where spirits are said to watch and wait. His father walked away without looking back. The village woke up the next morning and pretended he never existed. They laughed. They ate. They moved on. But the forest did not forget. 3 days later, hunters went into those woods. What they found beneath that tree made them drop to their knees in terror. The boy was alive, but he was no longer the same. His eyes glowed. Strange markings covered his skin, and around him sat a circle of wild animals, still, silent, protecting him. The hunters whispered one word, chosen. Now the village that abandoned him must face a terrifying truth. The ancestors have marked this child, and they've seen everything. This is not just a story about survival. It's about what happens when you betray the innocent and the ancient powers that rise to restore balance. They left him to die. But what came back was something far more powerful. The midwife pulled the baby from his dying mother's body, and the room fell silent.
No crying. No celebration.
Just the sound of a woman's final breath leaving her lungs, and a newborn gasping for air in a world that had already decided he didn't belong. Chima's mother had been loved, gentle, kind, and respected. But she was gone now, and all that remained was this tiny, wrinkled thing wrapped in blood-soaked cloth. His father held him once, just once, before handing him to his grandmother and walking out of the hut. He didn't cry.
He didn't speak.
He just left. And in that moment, Chima's fate was sealed. The boy would grow up knowing what it felt like to be a ghost in his own home. His father remarried within 6 months. The new wife was beautiful, sharp-eyed, sharp-tongued, and sharp in the way she looked at the boy who reminded everyone of the woman she could never replace. Her name was Adana, and she smiled at Chima in public, but in private, her smile turned to stone. She had her own children now, 2 boys, plump and loud and adored. Chima, meanwhile, grew thinner. His clothes were always too small, his bowl always half empty. When he asked for food, Adana would sigh and say, "Again, you eat like a curse." The other children laughed. His father said nothing, and Chima learned to stay quiet, to make himself smaller, to hope that invisibility might save him. It didn't. The whispers started after the harvest failed. The yams rotted in the ground. The cassava came up stunted and bitter. The rains, which always came in their season, refused to fall. And Adana, ever watchful, ever calculating, saw her opportunity. "It's the boy," she said one night, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. Ever since he was born, misfortune follows. His mother died, bringing him into this world. Now the land dies, feeding him. People who had known Chima since birth suddenly looked at him differently. The women pulled their children away when he passed. The men stopped greeting him. Even his own father began to flinch when Chima entered a room, as if the boy carried some invisible plague. Adana's poison had worked. Chima was no longer a child. He was a curse. He tried to prove them wrong. He worked harder than any child should, fetching water before dawn, tending the animals, clearing weeds until his hands bled. He never complained. He never cried. He thought that if he could just be good enough, useful enough, they might see him again. They might love him again. But every effort was met with suspicion. When he fixed the broken fence, Adana said he'd broken it on purpose. When he brought home firewood, She accused him of laziness for not bringing more. And when he dared to ask his father for a kind word, the man turned away, his face twisted with something Chima couldn't name. Was it guilt? Shame? Or just the slow, suffocating weight of a man who had chosen peace over his own blood? Then came the night Adana's youngest son fell ill. A fever, sudden and violent, that left the boy shaking and crying through the night. The village healer came, burned herbs, prayed to the gods, but the fever wouldn't break. And Adana, wild-eyed and desperate, pointed at Chima standing in the doorway. "It's him," she screamed. "He cursed my child. I see the way he looks at us. Jealous, hateful. He wants us dead, so he can take everything." Chima opened his mouth to defend himself, but no words came. How do you defend yourself against a lie everyone wants to believe? The villagers gathered. They murmured. They nodded. And Chima's father, the man who should have stood between his son and the mob, just looked at the ground. That night, the decision was made. Chima had to go. Not to another village. Not to a distant relative. Somewhere final. Somewhere permanent. They came for him 2 nights later. Chima wasn't asleep. He never really slept anymore. He heard the footsteps, heavy and deliberate, and he knew. His father entered first, avoiding his eyes, followed by 2 men from the village, their faces hard and unreadable. "Get up," his father said, his voice flat. Chima stood, his heart hammering, his mind racing. "Where are we going?" he asked, his voice small. No one answered. They grabbed him by the arms, rough and quick, and tied his wrists with coarse rope that bit into his skin. He didn't fight. What was the point? They dragged him out of the hut, past Adana, who stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and a smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Her eyes said everything. "You lose. I win." The forest loomed ahead, dark and endless, swallowing the moonlight whole. Chima's father walked in front, his shoulders hunched, his steps heavy. The other men flanked Chima, silent as shadows. No one spoke. No one looked back. And as they crossed the boundary between the village and the wilderness, Chima felt something break inside him. Not his body, but something deeper, something that couldn't be tied or beaten or starved. Hope. The last shred of it, burning out like a candle in the wind. He wanted to scream, to beg, to ask his father why now, why this, why him? But the words wouldn't come. So he walked, 1 foot in front of the other, into the darkness, into the place where children's nightmares were born. And behind him, the village disappeared, swallowed by the trees, as if it had never existed at all. As if he had never existed at all. The Forbidden Forest earned its name long before Chima was born. It was a place spoken of in hushed tones, where even the bravest hunters refused to venture after sunset. Stories said the spirits of the wronged lived there, trapped between worlds, waiting for justice that would never come. Leopards prowled its depths, silent as smoke, their eyes glowing in the blackness. And beneath the canopy, where sunlight never touched the ground, the air itself felt different, thicker, colder, alive. Chima had heard these stories his whole life. Now he was walking into them. The men who carried him didn't speak, but their breathing was ragged, their steps hurried. Even they were afraid. And if they were afraid, what chance did a small, starving boy have? None. That was the point. They walked for what felt like hours, deeper and deeper into the belly of the forest. The village sounds, dogs barking, children laughing, the hum of life, faded until there was nothing but the crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant calls of night birds. Chima stumbled, his legs weak from hunger and fear, and one of the men yanked him upright without a word. His father still walked ahead, his back rigid, his head down. Chima wanted to call out to him, to beg him to stop, to remember the man he used to be, the man who once sang Chima to sleep, who once promised to protect him. But that man was gone. The person leading him to his death was a stranger wearing his father's face. And maybe that was worse than anything else. Not the forest, not the darkness, but knowing his own father had chosen this. They reached the Irako tree just as the moon broke through the clouds. It was ancient, massive, its roots twisting across the ground like the fingers of some buried giant. The villagers said the tree was sacred, that it had been there since the beginning of time, a bridge between the living and the dead. Chima's father stopped in front of it and finally turned around. For a moment, their eyes met. Chima searched his father's face for something, regret, sorrow, love, but found only emptiness. "Tie him," his father said, his voice barely a whisper. The men obeyed. They pressed Chima's back against the rough bark and wrapped rope around his chest, his arms, his legs, pulling it tight until he couldn't move, couldn't breathe properly. The tree dug into his spine. The rope burned his skin. And still, no one spoke. His father stood there for a long moment, staring at his son, as if trying to memorize his face. Or maybe forget it. Chima couldn't tell. Then, without a word, the man turned and walked away. The other men followed. And just like that, Chima was alone. He opened his mouth to scream, to beg them to come back, but fear choked the words in his throat. He watched their shadows disappear into the trees, swallowed by the darkness, until even the sound of their footsteps faded. And then there was nothing. No voices. No movement. Just the forest, vast and silent and waiting. Chima's heart pounded so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. His breath came in short, panicked gasps. He pulled at the ropes, twisting, thrashing, but they held firm. He was trapped, helpless, alone. And the forest knew it. The cold came first. It seeped into his bones, slow and relentless, until his teeth chattered and his fingers went numb. Then came the sounds, rustling in the bushes, snapping twigs, the distant howl of something that might have been a hyena or something worse. Chima squeezed his eyes shut, willing himself to disappear, to wake up, to be anywhere but here. But when he opened them again, the forest was still there, pressing in on all sides, suffocating him with its presence. He thought about his mother, the woman he'd never known, and wondered if she was watching from wherever the dead go. He thought about his father walking away. He thought about Adana's smile. And he thought about how wrong it all was, how a child could be thrown away like garbage, how a family could become a trap, how love could turn to poison. But thinking didn't change anything. It never did. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time felt strange here, stretched and twisted. Chima's body sagged against the ropes, exhaustion pulling him under. His mind drifted, floating somewhere between consciousness and sleep, and in that hazy space, he heard something. A voice, soft and distant, like wind through leaves. "Why?" it whispered. Or maybe he whispered it. He couldn't tell anymore. Why me? What did I do? The questions hung in the air, unanswered, because the forest didn't care about fairness. It didn't care about innocence. It just was ancient, indifferent, eternal. But even as that thought settled over him like a shroud, something else stirred. A presence. Not hostile, but watchful. Curious. As if the forest itself had woken up and noticed the small, broken thing tied to its oldest tree. And for the first time since his father left, Chima wasn't sure if he was alone anymore. The night deepened, and the shadows grew teeth. Chima felt them watching, circling, deciding. His eyes, heavy with exhaustion, began to close despite his fear. And as sleep finally claimed him, pulling him down into the dark, one last thought flickered through his mind. Maybe this is how it ends. Maybe this is all I was ever meant to be, a boy nobody wanted, forgotten in a place nobody goes. But the forest, old and patient and impossibly vast, had other plans. Because in the spaces between the trees, where the moonlight couldn't reach, something ancient stirred. Something that had been waiting a very long time for a child like this. A child wronged. A child abandoned. A child whose suffering had finally, after all these years, called out to the ones who listen. The ancestors were waking up, and they were not pleased. Morning came, and the village woke as if nothing had happened. Roosters crowed. Women swept their doorsteps. Children chased each other through the dirt paths, their laughter echoing off the clay walls of the huts. Adana hummed as she cooked breakfast, stirring the pot with a wooden spoon, her face serene, satisfied. Her youngest son's fever had broken during the night. Coincidentally, she told the neighbors right after the boy was gone. "See," she said, her voice dripping with false relief. "The curse has lifted. The gods have spoken." People nodded. They wanted to believe her. It was easier than admitting what they'd just allowed to happen. Easier than facing the truth that they'd condemned a child to death because it was convenient. So they smiled. They ate. They moved on. And Chima's name was never spoken again. His father sat outside his hut, staring at nothing. He hadn't slept. His hands, calloused and strong from years of farm work, trembled as he tried to hold a cup of water. He couldn't drink it. Couldn't eat. Couldn't stop seeing his son's face in the moonlight, those wide, confused eyes searching for an explanation that never came. Adana walked past him, her hips swaying, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing," she said softly. "For the family. For the village. He was killing us all slowly." Her words should have brought comfort. Instead, they settled over him like a weight, pressing down on his chest until he couldn't breathe. He nodded because it was expected, but inside, something had broken, something that would never heal. He told himself it was mercy, that the boy would have died slowly here, unloved and unwanted. At least this way it was quick, clean, final. But the lie tasted like ash in his mouth. The villagers asked questions, of course. "Where's Chima?" Old Mama Kemi asked, her eyes sharp despite her age. Adana smiled sweetly. "He ran away in the night," she said, shaking her head with practiced sorrow. "Ungrateful child. After everything we did for him." Some people accepted the story immediately. Others hesitated, their eyes flickering to Chima's father, who sat silent and hollow-eyed. But no one pushed. No one demanded the truth. Because deep down they knew. And knowing meant responsibility. Meant guilt. Meant having to do something about it. So they swallowed their suspicions, buried their questions, and let the lie take root. Within a day, Chima had become a ghost story. A cautionary tale about cursed children and the dangers of disobedience. Within 2 days, he was barely a memory. By the 3rd day, it was as if he'd never existed at all. But in the forest, something very different was happening. Chima hadn't died. Not on the first night, when the cold bit through his thin clothes and his lips turned blue. Not on the second night, when hunger twisted his stomach into knots and delirium set in.
He should have.
By every law of nature, a child tied to a tree in the forbidden forest should have perished from exposure, from starvation, from the predators that prowled these woods looking for easy prey. But Chima was still breathing, still alive. And stranger still, he wasn't alone. Animals had begun to gather around him. Creatures that should have torn him apart, that should have seen him as food.
Instead, they sat.
watching, waiting. A leopard lay curled at the base of the tree, its golden eyes half closed. A python coiled nearby, motionless as stone. Birds perched on the branches above, silent guardians in the darkness. It made no sense. It defied everything anyone knew about the natural world. But the forest had never followed human rules. The ropes that bound Chima had loosened, though no one had touched them. The rough fibers, which should have held firm for weeks, had begun to fray as if worn by years instead of days. Chima barely noticed. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind a fog of pain and thirst and fragmented dreams. In those dreams, he saw his mother, a woman he'd never known, with kind eyes and a gentle voice. She touched his face and whispered words he couldn't quite hear. He saw other faces too, old, weathered, draped in shadows, their eyes glowing with something ancient and terrible. They spoke in a language that hummed in his bones, that vibrated through the tree and into his spine. And though he didn't understand the words, he understood their meaning. You are not forgotten. You are not alone. We see you, child. And we are coming. On the third night, the tree itself began to glow. Faint at first, like embers buried in ash, then brighter, pulsing in rhythm with Chima's heartbeat. The symbols appeared slowly, etching themselves into his skin, spirals and lines and shapes that had no name in any human language. They didn't hurt. If anything, they felt warm, like sunlight breaking through clouds. Chima's eyes fluttered open, and for the first time in 3 days, he saw clearly. The animals were still there, watching him with something that almost looked like reverence. The forest, once terrifying and hostile, now felt different. Protective, sacred, and somewhere deep inside him, in a place beyond words or thought, Chima understood. He had been claimed, not by death, but by something far older. The ancestors had marked him, and nothing, not his father, not Adana, not the village that threw him away, could undo what had been done. Back in the village, Adana woke screaming. She'd seen him, Chima, standing at the foot of her bed, his eyes glowing, his skin covered in strange markings.
He didn't speak.
Didn't move. Just stared at her with a gaze that saw straight through to her rotten core. She clawed at her husband, babbling, but when he lit the lamp, the room was empty. Just shadows. Just her guilt manifesting in the dark. But the image wouldn't leave her. Couldn't leave her. Because somewhere, miles away, tied to an ancient tree in a forest that remembered everything, a boy nobody wanted was becoming something nobody could ignore. The village had moved on. But the forest? The forest had just begun. The hunters left at dawn, 5 men with spears and bows, their faces set with determination. They were looking for game, antelope, bush pig, anything to feed their families during the lean season. They were good at what they did, respected in the village, known for their courage and skill. The forbidden forest didn't scare them, or so they told themselves. They'd hunted its edges before, always careful never to go too deep, never to stay past sunset. But game had been scarce lately, driven away by something they couldn't name, and desperation made men brave. Or stupid. So they pushed deeper than they ever had, following old animal trails, reading signs in the dirt. They joked to keep the fear at bay, their voices too loud in the thick silence. But the deeper they went, the quieter they became, because the forest was listening, and it was leading them somewhere. They found the clearing by accident, or maybe it found them. One moment they were pushing through dense undergrowth, the next they stood in an open space dominated by a massive Irako tree. The air here felt different, charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. The hunters stopped, their instincts screaming at them to turn back. But then one of them saw it. "Wait," he whispered, his voice tight with fear. "What is that?" They moved closer, slowly, weapons raised, every muscle tensed. And there, at the base of the tree, they saw him.
A boy.
Small, impossibly thin, his wrists still marked by frayed rope. He was alive. They could see his chest rising and falling, but that wasn't what made their blood run cold. It was everything else. The glowing symbols covering his skin. The circle of animals surrounding him. The way the air itself seemed to hum with power. One hunter dropped to his knees. Another whispered a prayer. And the bravest among them, a man who'd faced charging elephants without flinching, felt his hands shake. What is this?" he breathed. Chima's eyes opened. Not slowly, not groggily, but all at once, as if he'd been awake the whole time and just waiting for them to arrive. His gaze fixed on the hunters, and they saw something in those eyes that made them want to run. Not malice, not anger, but something far more unsettling. Recognition. As if he'd been expecting them. As if this moment had been written long before they were born. The animals didn't move. The leopard, close enough to kill any of them in seconds, simply yawned and settled its head on its paws. The python, thick as a man's thigh, remained coiled and still. The eagle above tilted its head, watching with one golden eye. It was wrong. All of it. Animals didn't behave this way. Children didn't survive 3 days alone in the forest. And skin didn't glow with symbols that seemed to pulse with their own light. But here it was impossible and undeniable. And the hunters, who'd come looking for food, realized they'd found something else entirely. "Don't touch him," the eldest hunter whispered, his voice barely audible. "Those marks, I've seen them before. In my grandfather's stories. The marks of the wronged. The ancestors claim." The others stared at him, uncomprehending. "What does that mean?" one asked. The old hunter's face had gone pale, his eyes wide with something close to terror. "It means this child has been judged. Not by us. Not by men. By something older. And if we harm him, if we turn away, we bring that judgment on ourselves." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. One of the younger hunters, brash and skeptical, stepped forward. "He's just a boy," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We should." He reached out, his hand inches from Chima's shoulder. The leopard moved. Not violently, just a shift, a low rumble in its throat. The hunter froze. Sweat beaded on his forehead. And very slowly, very carefully, he stepped back. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay, I understand." They couldn't leave him there. That much was clear. Whatever had happened to this child, whatever he'd become, abandoning him now felt like signing their own death warrants. So they approached carefully, speaking in soft tones, their movements slow and deliberate. The animals watched but didn't interfere. It was as if some silent permission had been granted. The old hunter knelt beside Chima, his hands shaking as he worked to untie the remaining rope. The fibers fell away like dust, disintegrating at his touch. Chima didn't speak, didn't resist. He simply watched them with those two old eyes, and the hunters felt the weight of that gaze like a physical thing. When they lifted him, he was impossibly light, as if the forest had hollowed him out and filled him with something else. The symbols on his skin pulsed faintly, warm to the touch. And as they carried him away from the tree, the circle of animals finally moved, melting back into the forest as silently as they'd come. But the hunters knew they'd been dismissed, not abandoned. The boy was marked, protected, chosen. And they were just messengers carrying news that would change everything. The journey back felt longer than the journey in. Every step was heavy, burdened not by the boy's weight, but by the implications of what they'd found. They didn't speak. What was there to say? They'd all seen it. They'd all felt it. The forest had claimed this child, and then sent him back.
Why?
For what purpose? The question spiraled, unanswered and terrifying. As they approached the village boundary, the old hunter stopped. "Listen," he said, his voice grave. "Whatever happened to this boy before, whatever was done to him, it's about to come to light. And when it does, there will be consequences. The ancestors don't forget. They don't forgive. They balance." The others nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. They'd found the boy nobody wanted. But what they were bringing back was something nobody could ignore. A reckoning. A mirror held up to the village's sins. And whether they liked it or not, judgment was coming. It was already here. They entered the village square just as the sun reached its peak. People looked up from their work, curious at first, then confused. Who was this boy? Why did he look like that? And then, one by one, recognition dawned.
Gasps.
Whispers. A woman screamed. Because the boy they were carrying, the boy covered in glowing marks, surrounded by an aura of otherworldly power, was Chima. The boy they'd thrown away. The boy they'd left to die. The boy who should have been dead. But here he was, alive and transformed, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on one face in particular. His father stood frozen at the edge of the square, his face drained of color, his mouth hanging open. And Chima, small and silent and impossibly powerful, simply stared. The hunters lowered him to the ground carefully, reverently, and stepped back. The villagers pressed closer, their fear mixed with morbid curiosity. And in the silence that followed, heavy and suffocating, everyone understood one terrible truth. The forest had spoken, and it had sent back proof that some sins are too great to bury. The village priestess arrived like a storm, old Mama Ozioma, bent with age but sharp as a blade, her white hair wrapped in sacred red cloth. She pushed through the crowd without ceremony, her walking stick striking the ground with each step, and people parted before her like water. She'd been the spiritual keeper of this village for 50 years, had delivered half its children, had buried the other half. She'd seen droughts and floods, plagues and miracles. But when her eyes landed on Chima, standing small and silent in the center of the square, she stopped. Her walking stick clattered to the ground. Her hand flew to her mouth. And for the first time in living memory, Mama Ozioma looked afraid. The crowd held its breath. If the priestess was shaken, they were all in trouble. She approached slowly, her eyes fixed on the symbols covering the boy's skin, her lips moving in silent prayer or maybe a curse. No one could tell which. She circled him once, twice, her breathing labored, her hands trembling. Then she knelt, her old knees cracking, and reached out to touch one of the marks on his arm. The moment her finger made contact, she jerked back as if burned, though the skin was cool. "No," she whispered, her voice thick with something between awe and horror.
No, no, no.
"This cannot be." She looked up at the crowd, her eyes wild.
Who did this?
Who cast this child out? The silence was deafening. Eyes shifted. Feet shuffled. No one wanted to answer, but everyone knew. Finally, someone pointed. All heads turned to Chima's father, who stood rooted to the spot, his face a mask of barely contained panic. Adana, standing beside him, tried to melt into the crowd, but hands grabbed her, held her in place. The priestess rose slowly, painfully, and fixed them both with a gaze that could peel skin. "Come here," she commanded. It wasn't a request. They came forward reluctantly, pushed by the crowd, their feet dragging. Chima's father couldn't look at his son. Adana's face had gone pale, her earlier confidence evaporating. Mama Ozioma stood between them and the boy, her body a barrier, her presence radiating authority. "Do you know what these are?" she asked, gesturing to the marks on Chima's skin. Neither answered. The priestess's voice rose, sharp and cutting. "These are the marks of the wronged, the language of the ancestors. When an innocent suffers at the hands of their own blood, when betrayal runs so deep it stains the very soul, the old ones take notice. They watch. They judge. And when they decide the crime is great enough, they mark the victim as their own." She paused, letting the words sink in. "This child has been claimed by forces older than this village, older than this forest, older than our memories. He is no longer just a boy. He is a vessel, a witness, and through him, the ancestors will speak." The crowd erupted in whispers, fear rippling through them like wind through grass. Chima's father finally found his voice, small and broken. "It wasn't supposed to. I didn't mean," but Mama Ozioma silenced him with a raised hand. "Intent means nothing now," she said coldly. "The deed is done. You took your own son, blood of your blood, and left him to die in the forbidden forest. For what? For a woman's jealousy? For peace in your home?" She spat the last word like poison. "There is no peace after this. There is only consequence." She turned to Adana, whose lips were trembling, her eyes darting for escape. "And you planted the poison. You whispered the lies. You turned father against son, village against child. Do you know what the ancestors do to those who harm the innocent?" Adana shook her head frantically. The priestess leaned in close, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the square. "They show them the mirror, and they make them look." Mama Ozioma turned back to Chima, her expression softening into something almost like reverence. She knelt again, this time with effort but also with purpose, and spoke directly to him. "Child, do you know what has happened to you?" Chima's voice, unused for days, came out as a rasp. "They left me." Simple words, but they landed like hammer blows. The priestess nodded.
Yes, they did.
"And in doing so, they opened a door. The forest heard your suffering. The ancestors answered. These marks tell a story, your story, of abandonment, of survival, of justice waiting to be served." She reached out again, more carefully this time, and touched his forehead. The symbols flared briefly, then settled. "You are protected now."
Claimed.
"No one can harm you. No one can cast you out again. But that protection comes with purpose. The ancestors don't act without reason. They've returned you to this place for a reason. Do you understand?" Chima nodded slowly. He didn't fully understand, not yet, but he felt it. A weight, a responsibility, a destiny he hadn't asked for but couldn't refuse. The priestess stood and faced the crowd. "These marks have not appeared in this village in 3 generations. The last time, it was during the great injustice, when the chief's brother was falsely accused and executed. The marked child then became a prophet, and everything he spoke came to pass. Blessings for the just, ruin for the corrupt. Some of you remember the stories. Your grandparents told them to scare you straight. But they weren't just stories. They were warnings." She paused, letting her words hang heavy. "This child has been wronged. Deeply. Irrevocably. And the ancestors have judged. What comes next is not mine to decide. It is not yours to decide. It is already written. The marks don't lie.
They don't forgive.
They simply are." A woman in the crowd began to wail. Others joined her. Men stared at the ground, shoulders slumped under the weight of collective guilt, because they'd all known. Maybe not the details, maybe not the method, but they'd known a child was missing, and they'd said nothing. They'd let it happen. And now, standing before them, proof of their sin glowed in the afternoon sun. Mama Ozioma placed a protective hand on Chima's shoulder. He will come with me.
To the sacred compound.
He needs rest, healing, guidance. And he needs to be taught what he's become. She looked at Chima's father and Adana one last time. As for you two, the ancestors will deal with you in their own time. I suggest you prepare yourselves. Beg their forgiveness. Make offerings. Pray for mercy. Her eyes narrowed. Though I doubt mercy will come. She turned to leave, guiding Chima gently, and the crowd parted in silence. As they walked away, people reached out, not to touch, but to see, to witness, to remember, because they knew they were watching history unfold. A boy had been cast out. The ancestors had claimed him. And now, whether the village liked it or not, the reckoning had begun. The marks didn't lie, and they couldn't be ignored. Not anymore. Not ever again. The emergency council convened at sunset in the meeting house, a circular structure with walls of clay and a roof of woven palm fronds. The elders filed in slowly, 7 men and 3 women, their faces etched with the weight of decades, their bodies bent, but their minds still sharp. This wasn't a casual gathering. The gong had been struck 3 times, the signal for crisis, for decisions that would shape the future of the entire village. They took their seats on low wooden stools arranged in a circle, and in the center, a fire crackled, casting dancing shadows across their weathered faces. No one spoke at first. The silence was thick with dread. Finally, Papa Ease, the oldest among them at 93 years, cleared his throat. His voice, though weak with age, carried authority that came from surviving longer than anyone else. We all saw the boy, he said. We all saw the marks. Now we must speak of things we hoped never to speak of again. The younger elders shifted uncomfortably. They'd heard stories, of course, fragments passed down from their grandparents, dismissed as folklore, as cautionary tales meant to frighten children into obedience. But seeing Chima, seeing those glowing symbols, had shattered the comfortable boundary between myth and reality. Papa Ease reached into his cloth bag and pulled out an old, yellowed piece of bark cloth, its surface covered in faded symbols that matched, exactly, the marks on Chima's skin. Gasps echoed around the circle. My grandfather gave this to me when I was a boy, Papa Ease said, his hands trembling as he held it up. He said it was a copy of the prophecy, recorded by the village priestess 4 generations ago. I never believed it. I thought it was just stories. But now I see I was a fool. The prophecy was real. And it's happening.
Right now.
Right here. He spread the cloth on the ground in the center of the circle, and the elders leaned in, squinting in the firelight.